I walked into my own kitchen that Tuesday evening, carrying groceries I'd carefully budgeted for, and found my 32-year-old son Michael whispering with my sister Linda by the window. They stopped talking the moment they saw me, but not before I caught the guilt flickering across both their faces. "Mom," Michael said, his voice carrying that careful tone he used when he was about to ask for something. "We were just discussing some family matters." Family matters. The phrase sat heavy in my chest because lately, I'd felt like an outsider to my own family. Linda had been visiting more frequently over the past month, always when Michael was home from his job at the insurance company, always finding reasons to stay for dinner or linger until late evening. I set the groceries on the counter, my hands steadier than my heart. What kind of family matters? Linda smoothed her perfectly styled hair, the same auburn shade mine used to be before I stopped coloring it to save money. She wore expensive jewelry that caught the kitchen light, reminders of the successful marriage she'd made while I raised Michael alone after his father left when he was 3. "Nothing that concerns you right now, Margaret," she said with that dismissive smile I'd known since childhood. "Just some decisions Michael needs to make about his future." His future. As if I hadn't spent 29 years planning, sacrificing, and building that future with my own hands. As if every choice I'd made since becoming a single mother hadn't been about giving him opportunities I'd never had. Michael avoided my eyes, fidgeting with his phone in that way he'd done as a teenager when he was hiding something. But he wasn't a teenager anymore. He was a grown man with a steady job, still living in my house because he claimed to be saving money, still eating my cooking and using my car when his needed repairs. "Michael," I said quietly, "what decisions?" That's when he looked at me directly for the first time since I'd entered my own kitchen. His eyes held something I'd never seen before. Not defiance exactly, but a cold calculation that made my stomach drop. "Mom, you need to understand something." His voice had changed, taken on the authoritative tone he used at work. "You raised me to take what I want, to not let opportunities pass by because of sentiment." The word hung in the air like a slap. Sentiment. As if my love, my sacrifices, my entire life devoted to his well-being was nothing more than emotional weakness. "What opportunity?" I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer would break something inside me that might never heal. Linda stepped closer to Michael, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable, intimate in a way that made my vision blur around the edges. "Margaret," Linda said, using the patient tone people reserve for slow children. "Michael and I have grown close over these past months. Very close. And we've realized that some arrangements in this house need to change. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching?" The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in while my sister stood in my space, touching my son, speaking about arrangements in my house as if I were a tenant whose lease was up for renewal. "Arrangements?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but didn't remove Linda's hand from his arm. "Mom, you have to admit this house is too big for just one person. And with Linda's divorce finally settled, she needs somewhere stable to land while she figures things out." Stable. My house was stable because I'd worked double shifts for years to pay the mortgage. I'd painted every wall myself, fixed every leaky faucet, replaced every worn carpet square by square when I couldn't afford professional installation. "She can stay in the guest room," I said automatically, still trying to process what was happening in my own kitchen. Linda laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Margaret. Sweet, naive Margaret. That's not exactly what we had in mind." The silence that followed lasted forever, and no time at all. In it, I watched my son, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia, the toddler I'd read bedtime stories to every night for years, the teenager I'd driven to baseball practice and helped with homework, look at me with eyes that belonged to a stranger. "You raised me to be strong," he said finally, "to not let guilt or obligation hold me back from what I want. Well, this is what I want. This." As if my sister was an object to be acquired, as if my home was property to be claimed, as if I was simply an obstacle to be managed rather than the woman who'd given him everything. I stood there holding a bag of groceries I'd bought to cook dinner for the 2 people who were casually dismantling my life, and felt something crack open in my chest. Not my heart breaking, but something deeper. Some fundamental belief about love and family, and the assumption that the people closest to you wouldn't deliberately destroy you. The bag slipped from my hands, oranges rolling across the floor I'd mopped that morning, and neither of them moved to help me gather them up. Over the following days, I watched my own home transform into something unrecognizable. Linda moved her suitcases into what had been Michael's room, claiming she needed the better closet space. Michael, meanwhile, had quietly relocated to the master bedroom, my bedroom, explaining with casual indifference that since Linda was using his room, this arrangement made the most sense. I found myself displaced to the guest room, the smallest bedroom in a house I'd been paying for since before Michael could walk. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become a guest in my own life. "It's just temporary, Mom," Michael said when I stood in the hallway holding my pillow and a change of clothes, staring at the closed door of my own bedroom. "Until we figure out a more permanent solution." Permanent solution. The words echoed in my head as I arranged my belongings in the cramped guest room that smelled faintly of mothballs and disuse. What exactly was the permanent solution they had in mind? Linda had settled into domestic life with disturbing ease. She cooked elaborate meals using ingredients I couldn't afford, then served them at my dining table while discussing plans for improvements to the house. New curtains for the living room, a different paint color for the kitchen, perhaps knocking out a wall to create more open space. "This house has such potential," she said over dinner one evening, cutting into a steak that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week. "With the right vision, it could be really something special." Michael nodded enthusiastically, as if he'd never noticed the house before Linda pointed out its flaws. The same house where he'd taken his first steps, learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway, brought friends home from school for snacks I'd prepared with whatever was left in my budget after paying bills. "Mom's always been too practical about decorating," he said, not looking at me. "Never really saw the possibilities. Too practical." As if my inability to afford unnecessary luxuries was a character flaw rather than a mathematical reality created by raising a child alone on a secretary's salary. I ate my dinner in silence, tasting nothing, while they planned renovations to my house as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, including me only when direct acknowledgement became unavoidable. "Margaret, you don't mind if we rearrange the living room, do you?" Linda asked with false sweetness. The couch would look so much better facing the other direction. The couch I'd saved for 8 months to buy. The couch where I'd held Michael when he was sick, where we'd watched movies together during his teenage years when he still wanted to spend time with his mother. "Of course not," I heard myself say, because what else could I say? They weren't really asking permission. They were informing me of decisions they'd already made. The next morning, I woke to the sound of furniture being moved. By the time I emerged from the guest room, my living room had been completely transformed. The couch now faced away from the window where I'd always enjoyed watching the sunrise with my morning coffee. The family photos that had decorated the mantel, pictures of Michael's graduation, our rare vacations, holidays we'd celebrated together, had been replaced with expensive candles Linda had purchased during one of her shopping trips. "Doesn't it look so much more sophisticated?" Linda asked, surveying her handiwork with obvious satisfaction. Sophisticated. Another word that felt like criticism, as if my previous choices had been childish or embarrassing. I looked around a room that no longer felt like home, searching for traces of the life I'd built there, finding only Linda's vision imposed over my memories. "Where are the photos?" I asked quietly. "Oh, those old things?" Linda waved dismissively. "I packed them away in a box in the hall closet. Honestly, Margaret, at your age, you should be looking forward, not backward." At my age. 57 wasn't ancient, despite Linda's implication that I'd reached some expiration date where memories became burdensome rather than precious. But standing in my transformed living room, I felt older than my years, worn down by the casual cruelty of people who were supposed to love me. Michael emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, expensive coffee Linda had bought to replace the store brand I'd always purchased. He handed one to Linda with a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. "Thanks, sweetheart," Linda said, the endearment landing like a physical blow. Sweetheart. She called my son sweetheart while I stood invisible in my own living room, holding a mug of instant coffee because there hadn't been enough of the good coffee for 3 people. "Mom," Michael said, finally acknowledging my presence. "Linda and I are going to look at some furniture stores today. The dining room set is looking pretty dated." The dining room set I'd inherited from my mother. the table where 3 generations of women had served family meals and homework help and birthday cakes made from box mixes because that's what we could afford. "There's nothing wrong with that table," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Well, no," Michael conceded, "but Linda thinks something more modern would really update the space. And honestly, Mom, when was the last time you entertained anyone here? If Linda's going to be hosting her friends, Linda's friends, in my house, around my mother's table, that was apparently too embarrassing for proper entertaining." I watched them leave together, Linda's hand tucked possessively into Michael's arm as they walked toward her car, a luxury sedan that made my 10-year-old Honda look shabby by comparison. They drove away to spend money I assumed was Linda's, making decisions about furniture that would fill my house, discussing changes to a home I was increasingly feeling like a stranger in. The silence after they left felt different than the solitude I'd grown accustomed to over the years. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of my own space. It was the hollow emptiness of exclusion, of being made to feel like an intruder in my own life. I sat in my rearranged living room, in a chair that now faced the wrong direction, and tried to understand how I'd become so invisible to the only person I'd ever put before myself. When had Michael stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to overcome? The house felt larger and smaller simultaneously, too big for one person, yet somehow not big enough for the 3 of us. Every room now carried the scent of Linda's expensive perfume. Every surface bore evidence of her casual assumption that my space was hers to claim and improve upon. I pulled my mother's photos from the hall closet where Linda had banished them, holding each image like a prayer. Here was Michael at 8, gap-toothed and proud, showing off a science project we'd worked on together for weeks. Here was Michael at 16, embarrassed but tolerant as I insisted on taking pictures before his first job interview. Here was Michael at 25, his arm around me at my birthday dinner, his smile genuine and warm. When had that warmth turned to indifference? When had my love become something to manage rather than treasure? I tried to maintain normalcy, clinging to the routines that had always anchored my days. Every morning, I made breakfast for 3 people, setting the table with the same care I'd shown for 29 years. I cooked Michael's favorite pancakes, the ones I'd perfected through countless Saturday mornings when he was young and still thought spending time with his mother was the best way to start the weekend. But now he barely glanced at the plate I set before him, too absorbed in whatever conversation he was having with Linda about their plans for the day. She ate delicately, commenting on how the syrup was too sweet or the pancakes too heavy, suggestions delivered with the casual authority of someone who assumed her preferences would naturally become household policy. "Margaret, you really should try using less sugar in everything," Linda said, dabbing her lips with one of my good napkins. "At our age, we need to think about our health. Our age." As if we were peers. As if the 8 years between us hadn't always positioned her as my younger sister, who'd benefited from every mistake I'd made navigating life first. "I like them the way they are," Michael said, but his tone was distracted, dismissive, the way you might respond to a waitress who'd asked if everything was satisfactory. I collected their plates when they finished, washing dishes while they discussed their day's agenda, shopping for new bedding, lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown, a visit to Linda's attorney to finalize some aspect of her divorce settlement that apparently required Michael's presence. "Why do you need Michael to come with you?" I asked, genuinely curious about what role my son played in my sister's legal proceedings. Linda exchanged a look with Michael, one of those silent communications that excluded me completely. "Just some paperwork that needs witnessing," she said vaguely. "Michael's been so helpful with all the complicated financial stuff." Financial stuff. I wondered what expertise my son, who'd never successfully managed his own budget, could offer my sister, who'd been married to a wealthy businessman for 15 years. After they left, I spent the morning cleaning a house that was beginning to feel like a museum exhibit of someone else's life. Linda's expensive moisturizers had claimed space on my bathroom counter. Her silk scarves hung in my hall closet. Her books, romance novels with embossed covers and self-help guides about manifesting abundance, had replaced my gardening magazines on the coffee table. When they returned in the afternoon, they carried shopping bags from stores I'd never been able to afford to browse. New sheets for my bedroom, where Michael now slept. New towels for my bathroom, where Linda now kept her extensive collection of beauty products. New throw pillows for my living room, where I apparently no longer had any say in the decorating decisions. "We found the most amazing deals," Linda announced, though the bags bore the logos of department stores where amazing deals typically started at more than I spent on clothing in a year. "Mom, you should see the sheets we picked out," Michael said with enthusiasm I hadn't heard from him in months. "Really high thread count. You'll love how they feel." I would love how they felt in my own bedroom, where I was no longer welcome to sleep. The irony seemed lost on him entirely. "That's nice, sweetheart," I said, the endearment feeling strange on my tongue when directed at someone who'd become a stranger. "Linda has such great taste," Michael continued. "She's really helped me understand quality, how sometimes it's worth spending more to get something that's actually good quality. As if everything I'd ever bought, every careful choice I'd made with limited resources, had been inferior. As if the sheets I'd saved for months to purchase were somehow shameful compared to Linda's expensive selections. That evening, I offered to cook dinner, suggesting Michael's favorite meal, the pot roast I'd been making every Sunday for years, slow-cooked until it fell apart with a fork, served with mashed potatoes and the green beans he'd actually eaten as a child. "Oh, that sounds so heavy," Linda said before Michael could respond. "I was thinking something lighter. Maybe that salmon recipe I saw in my cooking magazine?" My cooking magazine. She'd been subscribing to expensive culinary publications in my name, magazines that arrived addressed to my house but contained recipes requiring ingredients I'd never heard of and cooking equipment I didn't own. "Salmon sounds great," Michael agreed immediately. "Mom, do you mind if Linda takes over the kitchen tonight? She's been wanting to try this new recipe." Mind. As if my feelings were a minor inconvenience to be acknowledged and dismissed. As if my kitchen was a privilege to be granted rather than my own space. "Of course not," I said, because what else could I say? I watched from the doorway as Linda commanded my kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd never had to calculate the cost of every ingredient. She used my best pans, the ones I'd kept carefully seasoned and scratch-free for years. She opened spices I'd never purchased, herbs that cost more per ounce than most of my meals cost per serving. "Margaret, could you run to the store?" Linda called over her shoulder. "I need capers and that good olive oil. The expensive kind." I left a list on the counter. The list contained items that would cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Imported olive oil, organic vegetables, a bottle of wine that cost what I typically spent on food for 3 days. "I'm not sure I can afford," I began. "Oh, don't worry about it," Linda interrupted. "Michael gave me his credit card. Just put it all on there." Michael's credit card. The one he'd qualified for based on the steady job he'd maintained while living rent-free in my house, eating food I purchased, using utilities I paid for. The financial independence he'd built on the foundation of my support, now being used to purchase ingredients for meals he'd share with my sister while I sat at the periphery of my own dining room. At the store, I picked items from Linda's list with growing resentment. Each expensive ingredient felt like evidence of how completely I'd been replaced, how effortlessly Linda had stepped into my role as the woman who nurtured Michael, who created the domestic comfort he'd always taken for granted. When I returned, the kitchen smelled like a restaurant, filled with aromas I'd never been able to create with my simple meals and basic ingredients. Linda moved through my space like she owned it, confident and graceful in ways I'd never felt, even in my own home. "Perfect timing," she said, barely glancing at me as I set the shopping bags on the counter. "Michael's opening the wine. This is going to be such a lovely evening." Lovely for whom, I wondered, watching Michael uncork a bottle that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in 2 weeks. They sat at my dining table, my mother's table, sharing wine and sophisticated conversation about restaurants and vacation destinations while I served myself a small portion of salmon and sat in what had apparently become my designated chair at the end of the table. "This is incredible, Linda," Michael said, raising his glass in appreciation. "You're so talented." Talented. The word stung because it implied skills I'd never possessed, abilities I'd never developed because I'd been too busy working and budgeting and sacrificing to learn the kind of cooking that impressed, rather than simply nourished. "I've always loved creating beautiful meals," Linda replied, her voice warm with the pleasure of being appreciated. "It's such a joy to cook for people who can really appreciate good food. People who could appreciate good food." The implication was clear. I was not such a person. My appreciation had apparently been inadequate, my gratitude insufficient, my palate too unsophisticated to properly value the care that went into meal preparation. I finished my dinner in silence, listening to them plan a weekend trip to wine country, discussing restaurants they wanted to visit and hotels that charged more per night than I earned in a week. They spoke as if I weren't there, their conversation flowing around me like I was a piece of furniture they'd grown accustomed to ignoring. When I offered to clean up, Linda waved me away with gracious dismissal. "Oh no, Margaret. You've done enough today. Michael and I will handle the dishes. Done enough." As if purchasing their expensive ingredients and sitting quietly through their dinner had been my contribution to the evening, my role complete now that the real participants could enjoy their private time together. I began withdrawing into myself, finding refuge in the guest room that had become my exile. The walls seemed thinner there, unable to muffle the sounds of Michael and Linda's domestic bliss happening in the rest of my house. Their laughter drifted through the heating vents, intimate conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I appeared in common areas. My phone rarely rang anymore. The few friends I'd maintained over the years, other single mothers who understood the challenges of raising children alone, had gradually faded from my life as Linda's presence made social visits awkward and uncomfortable. How do you explain that your sister has moved in with your adult son, claiming space and authority in your home while treating you like an unwelcome relative? The silence in my small room felt heavy, pressing against my chest during the long hours when Michael and Linda were out together, living a life that seemed to require my absence to function properly. I'd taken to eating my dinner alone, preparing simple meals that wouldn't compete with Linda's elaborate culinary performances, sitting at the kitchen counter while they occupied the dining room with their sophisticated conversations. One evening, I prepared what had always been Michael's favorite meal from childhood: grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food for a rainy Thursday when the house felt cold despite the central heating. I made 3 portions out of habit, setting the table hopefully, wondering if maybe tonight we could pretend to be a family again. Michael appeared in the kitchen just as I was ladling soup into bowls, his face showing the polite confusion of someone who'd discovered their housekeeper had prepared an unexpected meal. "Mom, we already ate?" he said gently, as if breaking disappointing news to a child. "Linda made that pasta dish with the truffle oil. It was amazing, amazing." While I'd been in my room reading, they'd shared another dinner together, another intimate meal that didn't require my presence or participation. "I didn't know," I said quietly, staring at the 3 bowls of soup that suddenly looked pathetic and inadequate. "I thought maybe we could eat together tonight." "That's sweet, Mom, but we've got plans to watch a movie Linda's been wanting to see. Maybe tomorrow?" "Maybe tomorrow." The phrase had become his standard response to any invitation I extended, any attempt to reclaim a small piece of our former relationship. Tomorrow never came, always postponed by more immediate plans with Linda, more interesting activities that didn't include his mother. I ate my grilled cheese alone, tasting nothing, listening to their movie playing in the living room, my living room, where my couch now faced away from the window where I used to watch the sunset. The sounds of their evening entertainment leaked under my closed bedroom door, reminding me that life was continuing without my participation in the very house I'd worked so hard to maintain. The refrigerator had become a battleground of subtle territory marking. Linda's expensive yogurts and imported cheeses occupied the front shelves, while my modest groceries were pushed to the back corners. Her bottles of sparkling water lined the door where my diet sodas used to sit. Even the condiments had been upgraded, artisanal mustards and organic ketchup replacing the store brands I'd always purchased. Late one night, unable to sleep on the uncomfortable pull-out mattress that served as my bed, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found a note on the refrigerator in Linda's elegant handwriting: "Grocery list for Margaret. Please pick up tomorrow." The list contained items I couldn't afford and brands I'd never heard of, written with the casual assumption that I was now the household servant responsible for maintaining their preferred lifestyle. I crumpled the note and threw it away, then immediately felt guilty for the small act of rebellion. What was wrong with helping with groceries? Wasn't that what family members did for each other? But the questions that haunted my sleepless nights went deeper than household chores. When had I become the outsider in my own family? When had my love become something to be managed rather than cherished? When had Michael learned to look at me with the cool evaluation of someone calculating my usefulness rather than appreciating my devotion? The next morning brought another small humiliation disguised as thoughtful consideration. I discovered that Linda had arranged for a house cleaner to come weekly, explaining that she wanted to lighten my load around the house. "You work so hard, Margaret," she said with false concern. "And at your age, you shouldn't be doing all this heavy cleaning." At my age. There it was again, the gentle implication that I'd crossed some invisible threshold into irrelevance, that my contributions were now more burden than benefit. "I don't mind cleaning my own house," I said, though the words sounded weak even to my own ears. "Of course you don't. But why should you have to? Michael insisted we hire someone. He worries about you overexerting yourself," Michael insisted. My son, who'd never voluntarily cleaned anything in his life, was now concerned about my exertion in maintaining the house I'd been cleaning perfectly well for decades. The house cleaner, a efficient woman named Rosa, who spoke little English but worked with impressive thoroughness, arrived every Wednesday morning. I found myself hiding in the guest room during her visits, embarrassed to be caught in my own home by someone who was being paid to do work I'd always done myself. Rosa cleaned around my life like I was another piece of furniture to be dusted and repositioned. She organized closets according to Linda's preferences, arranged toiletries to accommodate Linda's extensive beauty routine, polished surfaces to showcase Linda's decorative improvements. One Wednesday, I emerged from my room to find Rosa had apparently been instructed to pack away more of my personal items. The family photos that had briefly returned to the mantel were once again relegated to boxes in the hall closet. My books, mystery novels, and gardening guides I'd collected over years, had been moved to make room for Linda's coffee table books about interior design and European travel. "Rosa, why are you packing my things?" I asked, finding her carefully wrapping my mother's china figurines in tissue paper. She looked up with apologetic confusion, then gestured toward a note written in Linda's handwriting. "Pack away clutter from living room shelves. Store in hall closet. Clutter. My memories, my mother's treasures, the accumulated artifacts of a life lived in this house, all reduced to clutter that needed to be hidden away to maintain Linda's vision of sophisticated living." I spent that afternoon sitting in my car in the driveway of my own house, unable to face going inside where Rosa was efficiently erasing more evidence of my existence. Through the windows, I could see her moving through rooms that used to feel like home, implementing changes that made my space increasingly unrecognizable. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Running late from work. Tell Linda I'll pick up dinner on the way home. Thanks, Mom. Tell Linda." As if I were the household messenger, responsible for coordinating their lives while having no real role in them, the casual assumption that I'd be available to relay his message, that my time and attention were freely accessible resources for their convenience. When they returned that evening with expensive takeout from a restaurant I'd never been able to afford, they ate in the dining room while I sat in the kitchen with a frozen dinner I'd heated in the microwave. Through the doorway, I could hear their conversation about weekend plans, vacation ideas, improvements they wanted to make to what they now referred to as the house, rather than Mom's house. "We should really do something about that guest room," Linda said, her voice carrying clearly into the kitchen where I sat with my institutional meal. "It's such wasted space. We could turn it into a proper office or maybe a workout room." The guest room. My room. The only space in the house that still belonged to me, however temporarily. "That's a great idea," Michael agreed. "Mom probably doesn't really need a separate room anyway. The living room couch is actually pretty comfortable." The living room couch that now faced away from my favorite window, where I would presumably sleep while they occupied all the actual bedrooms in my house. I finished my dinner in mechanical silence, then retreated to the room they were planning to eliminate, wondering how much longer I could pretend this situation was temporary, how much more invisible I could become before I disappeared entirely. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. That night, alone in what they considered wasted space, I sat on the edge of my temporary bed and opened the small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. Hidden beneath the few pieces of costume jewelry I rarely wore was a key I'd almost forgotten existed, the key to the safety deposit box I'd opened 23 years ago when Michael was 9 years old, and I'd finally scraped together enough money for my first real savings account. Over the years, that box had held our most important documents: Michael's birth certificate, my divorce papers, insurance policies, and the deed to this house. But it also contained something else, something I'd placed there during a moment of clarity that now seemed prophetic. I remembered the day clearly. Michael had been 10, old enough to understand that other families had more than we did, young enough to complain bitterly about our modest Christmas compared to his friends' elaborate celebrations. He'd thrown a tantrum about wanting expensive toys we couldn't afford, accusing me of not loving him enough to buy what he really wanted. "If you really loved me, you'd find a way," he'd sobbed, his young face twisted with the kind of raw disappointment that children experience when they first encounter the limitations of their circumstances. That night, after he'd cried himself to sleep, I'd sat at my mother's kitchen table and written a letter. Not to Michael, he was too young to understand, but to the woman I might become someday, the mother I hoped I'd remember to be when my sweet boy grew into a man who might forget the sacrifices that had shaped his comfortable life. Now, 23 years later, I held that envelope in hands that shook slightly as I broke the seal I'd pressed shut with my own tears all those years ago. "My dear future self," the letter began in handwriting that looked impossibly young and optimistic. "I'm writing this on December 26th, the day after Michael told me I didn't love him enough because I couldn't buy him everything he wanted for Christmas. I hope by the time you read this, he understands what love really looks like." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing every sacrifice I'd made during Michael's first decade. The nights I'd gone to bed hungry so he could have seconds at dinner, the times I'd worn the same coat for 5 winters so he could have new school clothes, the way I'd chosen staying home with him over pursuing the college degree that might have improved our financial situation. But more than cataloging hardships, the letter reminded me of moments of pure joy I'd somehow forgotten. Michael at age 7, making me a birthday card from construction paper and telling me I was the best mom in the whole universe. Michael at age 5, saving half his Halloween candy for when mommy gets sad. Michael at age 8, hugging me fiercely after I'd worked a double shift, saying, "I missed you so much, Mama. Don't ever leave me." When had that adoring child transformed into the cold stranger who now saw me as an obstacle to his happiness? The letter's final paragraph brought tears I'd been holding back for weeks. "I know there will be times when he takes your love for granted, when he forgets that everything he has came from your willingness to give everything you had. When that happens, remember that you raised him to be strong and independent, even if that strength is sometimes turned against you. You gave him a foundation of love so solid that he feels safe enough to reject it. That's not failure, that's success. But don't let anyone, even him, convince you that your love was worthless or your sacrifices meaningless. You are enough. You have always been enough." Reading those words felt like receiving advice from a wiser version of myself, someone who'd understood something I'd lost sight of over the years. I wasn't the problem in this situation. My love hadn't been inadequate or suffocating or shameful. I had given my son exactly what a mother should give: unconditional support, consistent presence, and the security to become his own person. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The next morning brought a different energy to my movements. Instead of tiptoeing around my own house trying not to disturb Michael and Linda's domestic bliss, I made my coffee at my normal volume and sat at my kitchen table reading the newspaper I'd been buying for 30 years. When Linda appeared in her silk robe, hair perfectly arranged despite having just woken up, she seemed surprised to find me occupying space in the kitchen. "Oh, Margaret, you're up early," she said with that false brightness that had become her default tone with me. "Actually, this is my normal time," I replied calmly. "I've been getting up at 6:30 for work for over 20 years. Something in my tone must have registered as different, because Linda paused in her progress toward the expensive coffee maker, studying my face as if trying to identify what had changed. "Of course," she said carefully. "I just meant, well, you've been so quiet lately." Quiet. As if my retreat into invisibility had been a personal choice rather than a response to their systematic exclusion. "I've been thinking," I said, turning a page of my newspaper with deliberate casualness, "about a lot of things." Michael appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, moving with the hurried efficiency of someone who'd learned to grab breakfast and leave without extended conversation. He paused when he saw me sitting at the table instead of hiding in my room. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "You're up early?" "No, sweetheart," I said, letting the endearment carry more weight than usual. "I'm up at exactly the same time I've been getting up since before you could walk. You've just been too distracted to notice." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of discomfort with arrangements he'd grown accustomed to taking for granted. "Linda," I continued, Addressing my sister directly, "I've been meaning to ask about your plans. How much longer are you thinking of staying?" The question hung in the air like a small explosion. Both Michael and Linda had grown comfortable with the assumption that their current arrangement was permanent, that my displacement was simply the new normal that everyone had agreed to accept. "Well," Linda said, glancing at Michael for support, "I thought we'd discuss this. My divorce settlement should be finalized soon, and then Michael and I can start making more permanent arrangements." Permanent arrangements. There it was again, the casual assumption that my future was theirs to determine. "What kind of permanent arrangements?" I asked, my voice steady and curious rather than confrontational. Michael shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that I was asking questions instead of simply accepting information. "Mom, we talked about this. Linda needs stability right now, and this house is really too big for just one person anyway." Too big for just one person? The person who'd been paying the mortgage, maintaining the property, and building equity in these walls for over 15 years. "You're right," I said, surprising them both. "This house is too big for just one person. It's a family home. It needs a family living in it." The relief on their faces was almost comical, as if they'd expected resistance to a conclusion they thought I'd finally reached. "Exactly," Linda said with renewed confidence. "Michael and I have been talking about how perfect this place could be for us. With some renovations, of course, but the bones are so good. The bones. My house reduced to structural elements that could support their vision of domestic happiness." "I'm so glad we agree," I said, standing to rinse my coffee cup in the sink that had served me faithfully for decades, "because I've been thinking it's time for me to start looking into some changes too." The way they looked at each other, that silent communication that excluded me completely, told me everything I needed to know about how they'd been discussing my future. But they had no idea what changes I had in mind, or what foundation of strength I'd been building while they'd been busy planning their paradise in my exile. I left them in the kitchen, confused by my sudden shift from passive acceptance to active engagement, and went to get dressed for a day that would be different than any I'd had in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like myself again. My first stop that morning was the bank where I'd maintained accounts for over 2 decades. Patricia, the branch manager who'd helped me open my first savings account when Michael was small, greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who'd witnessed years of small deposits and careful financial planning. "Margaret, how lovely to see you," she said, leading me to her office. "It's been a while since you've come in person. I need to review all my accounts," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Everything. I want to understand exactly what I have and what my options are." Patricia's expression shifted to professional attention as she pulled up my files on her computer. Over the next hour, we went through every detail of my financial situation. The checking account where my paychecks were deposited, the savings account I'd built slowly over decades, the retirement fund I'd contributed to despite tight budgets, and most importantly, the house deed and mortgage information. "You've been very responsible with your finances," Patricia said, reviewing the numbers. "Your mortgage balance is quite manageable given your equity position. Have you considered refinancing? Interest rates have improved since you initially bought." "Actually," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm more interested in understanding my options if I wanted to sell." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but also liberating. For months, I'd felt like a prisoner in my own home, accepting the gradual erosion of my authority and comfort, as if I had no alternatives. Patricia nodded professionally. "The market has been quite strong in your neighborhood. Houses similar to yours have been selling well above assessed value. Would you like me to connect you with our real estate partner for a market analysis?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'd like to understand exactly what my house is worth." After the bank, I drove to the library, a place that had always been my sanctuary when I needed quiet space to think. In the computer section, I researched rental properties in areas I'd never previously considered. Smaller towns where the cost of living would allow me to live comfortably on my modest income. Places where I could afford a small apartment or condominium without the burden of maintaining a large house that no longer felt like home. The possibilities were surprisingly numerous. Charming retirement communities designed for people who wanted simplified living. Senior housing complexes with built-in social activities and maintenance-free lifestyles. Even small houses in nearby towns where I could have a garden and privacy without the financial stress that had defined most of my adult life. For the first time in months, I felt something resembling excitement about the future. That evening, Michael and Linda were deep in conversation when I arrived home, their heads bent over Linda's laptop as they browsed furniture websites. They looked up when I entered, and something in their expressions suggested they'd been discussing me in my absence. "Mom," Michael said with forced casualness, "Linda and I were talking about maybe having some friends over this weekend. Would that be okay with you?" The question was phrased as a request, but his tone suggested he wasn't really asking permission so much as informing me of plans that had already been made. "What kind of gathering?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they envisioned entertaining guests in my living room. "Just dinner," Linda said smoothly. "Some of my friends from the country club, maybe a few couples Michael knows from work. Nothing too elaborate. Nothing too elaborate. Except I could already envision the expensive wine, the catered food, the careful staging of my house to present the image of sophisticated hosts rather than guests who'd gradually taken over someone else's home." "Where were you thinking of having people eat?" I asked. "The dining room only seats 6 comfortably." "Well," Linda said, exchanging that familiar glance with Michael, "we thought maybe you wouldn't mind eating in the kitchen that night, just to give us more space in the dining room for our guests, in my house, while I ate alone in my own kitchen like hired help." "Actually," I said, sitting down across from them, "I had some interesting conversations today that I think we should discuss." The laptop screen reflected in their faces as they looked up with matching expressions of polite attention that didn't quite hide their underlying tension. "I went to the bank this morning," I continued conversationally. "Spoke with Patricia about my financial situation. Did you know this house has appreciated significantly over the past few years?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "That's great, Mom. Good investment." "It really is," I agreed. "Patricia thinks I could get well above market value if I decided to sell. The neighborhood has become quite desirable." The silence that followed was different than the comfortable quiet of people processing interesting information. This was the charged stillness that precedes thunderstorms, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. "Sell?" Linda said carefully. "Why would you want to sell? This house is perfect for your needs. My needs. As defined by people who'd systematically restructured my living situation to suit their preferences." "Well," I said, enjoying the way they were both suddenly paying complete attention to my words, "I've been thinking about what you said, Michael, about this house being too big for one person. You're absolutely right." Relief flickered across their faces before I continued. "So I started researching alternatives. There are some lovely senior communities about an hour from here. Maintenance-free living, built-in social activities, much more appropriate for a woman my age." "Mom," Michael said quickly, "you don't need to move to a senior community. You're not that old. Not that old." Interesting how my age had become negotiable now that their comfortable arrangement was threatened. "Oh, I think it could be wonderful," I said with genuine enthusiasm. "No more worrying about lawn care or roof repairs or property taxes. Just a simple apartment with everything I actually need." "But what about—" Linda began, then stopped, apparently realizing she couldn't finish that sentence without revealing how completely she'd assumed ownership of my space. "What about what?" I prompted gently. "What about us?" Michael said, his voice carrying a note of panic I hadn't heard since he was a child, afraid of being left alone. "Us." Finally, an acknowledgement that us had meant something, even if that meaning had been temporarily obscured by his infatuation with Linda and the lifestyle she represented. "What about you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral and curious. "You're both adults with your own resources and opportunities. I'm sure you'll figure out housing arrangements that work for your situation." "Mom," Michael said, leaning forward with sudden urgency, "you can't just sell the house. This is our family home. This is where I grew up. Our family home, where he'd grown up in the bedroom that now belonged to Linda, eating meals at the table where Linda now held court, living in spaces that had been redesigned according to Linda's aesthetic preferences." "You're absolutely right," I said. "This is where you grew up, but you're not growing up anymore, are you? You're a grown man who's made it very clear that your future lies elsewhere." "I never said that," Michael protested. "Didn't you?" I asked gently. "When you told me I was too practical about decorating, when you moved into my bedroom without asking, when you stopped eating meals with me, when you started making plans for renovations without consulting me, when you told Linda's friends were more important than my comfort in my own home?" Each question landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread across his face. "I didn't mean," he began, then stopped, perhaps realizing that his intentions mattered less than the cumulative impact of his choices. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely sorry for him rather than angry. "But impact and intention aren't the same thing, sweetheart." Linda had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd been calculating her response. "Margaret, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Michael and I never intended to make you feel unwelcome in your own home. If we've overstepped somehow, as though my displacement had been a matter of interpretation rather than systematic execution." "Linda," I said, turning to face her directly, "you've been nothing but clear about your intentions. You wanted this house, this life, this version of domestic comfort, and you've taken it, piece by piece, with Michael's enthusiastic cooperation." "That's not fair," Michael said, but his protest lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Then explain to me how we got to a place where I'm sleeping in the guest room of my own house while you plan dinner parties I'm expected to avoid." The answer hung unspoken in the air between us, as clear and undeniable as the evidence of Linda's belongings scattered throughout my transformed home. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time since Linda's arrival, I wasn't the one seeking approval or acceptance. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space or defending my right to exist in my own home. Instead, I was simply stating facts and watching them grapple with realities they'd successfully ignored for months. "Mom," Michael said finally, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since childhood, "I never wanted you to feel like you didn't belong here, but that's exactly what happened," I replied calmly. "Whether you wanted it or not." Linda cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of a conversation that had shifted beyond her ability to manage. "Perhaps we can find a compromise that works for everyone. Some kind of arrangement where we all feel comfortable." "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she planned to solve a problem she'd created. "Well," Linda said, her confidence rebuilding as she warmed to a topic she'd clearly thought about extensively, "Michael and I have been discussing the possibility of officially taking over the mortgage payments. We could handle all the household expenses, and you could live here rent-free. Think of it as retirement at 57, while they claimed ownership of my house, my kitchen, my dining room, and my bedroom." "That's very generous," I said, "but I'm not ready to retire, and I'm not ready to be a dependent in my own home." "You wouldn't be a dependent," Michael insisted. "You'd be family. Family." The word that had justified every encroachment, every assumption, every gradual erosion of my autonomy. "Michael," I said, leaning back in my chair with something approaching serenity, "can you honestly tell me that I've been treated like family these past few months?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to find words that wouldn't sound like lies even to his own ears. "When was the last time you asked my opinion about anything that affected this house?" I continued. "When was the last time you considered my preferences before making plans? When was the last time you treated me like someone whose feelings mattered, rather than someone whose cooperation you could take for granted?" The questions accumulated in the air between us, each one requiring an honesty I wasn't sure he was capable of providing. He began, then stopped, his face cycling through expressions I recognized from his childhood: guilt, defensiveness, the dawning realization that he'd been caught in behavior he couldn't justify. "The truth is," I said gently, "you've been treating me like an obstacle to your happiness, both of you. And now that I'm suggesting I might remove that obstacle by leaving, you're suddenly concerned about my welfare." Linda's composure finally cracked. "Margaret, you're being deliberately unfair. We've tried to include you." "How?" I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying new authority. "By packing away my photos? By replacing my furniture? By taking over my bedroom? By planning dinner parties I'm expected to avoid? By treating my kitchen like your personal domain? By discussing renovations to my house as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away?" Each example hit like a physical blow, and I could see Linda recalculating her approach as she realized the systematic nature of what she'd done. "Those were just improvements," she said weakly. "Ways to make the house more beautiful for everyone." "For everyone?" I asked. "Or for you?" Michael finally found his voice, though it sounded strained and uncertain. "Mom, Maybe we didn't handle things the right way, but we were trying to help. You seemed so tired, so overwhelmed by maintaining this place alone. I was tired, I admitted, but I was managing just fine until you decided I needed help I hadn't asked for and didn't want. We were trying to take care of you, he insisted. No, I said, and for the first time in months, my voice carried the authority of complete certainty. You were trying to take care of yourselves, and you used my love as permission to do whatever felt convenient. The silence that followed was profound. In it, I could almost see the careful justifications they'd built, crumbling under the weight of truth they couldn't refute. What do you want us to do? Michael asked finally, and something in his voice reminded me of the little boy who used to come to me when he'd broken something and needed help fixing it. I want you to tell me the truth, I said, about what you really want, about what you've been planning, about how you see this situation resolving in ways that make you happy. Linda and Michael exchanged another of their silent communications, but this time the look carried desperation rather than conspiracy. We want to be together, Linda said finally. We want to build a life together. And this house? It feels like home to us. My house feels like home to you, I corrected gently. Yes, she admitted, perhaps realizing that honesty was her only remaining option. And what role do you see me playing in the life you want to build in my house? I asked. Another long silence, another exchange of glances that confirmed what I already knew, but needed to hear them acknowledge. We thought, Michael began, then stopped, apparently unable to complete the sentence. You thought I would just fade into the background, I said, finishing it for him. You thought I would be so grateful for whatever scraps of attention you offered that I'd accept any arrangement as long as it meant I wasn't completely alone. Mom, that's not— It's exactly that, I said, cutting him off with quiet firmness. You thought my love for you was so desperate and unconditional that you could take everything— my house, my space, my dignity, my role in my own life, and I'd thank you for allowing me to remain as a tolerated presence in my own home. The accuracy of the assessment was written across both their faces, shame and embarrassment replacing the confidence they'd worn while their plan was working. But here's what you didn't understand, I continued, standing up from the table with deliberate slowness. My love for you was never desperate. It was generous. There's a difference. I walked to the kitchen counter where I'd left the real estate information I'd printed at the library, bringing the papers back to the table where they sat in stunned silence. Generous love gives freely, I said, placing the documents in front of them. But it doesn't give away the giver. And it certainly doesn't sacrifice one person's dignity to purchase another person's comfort. The papers showed property values, rental prices in other areas, information about senior communities that offered the kind of independent living I'd been researching. I'm putting the house on the market next week, I said simply. The realtor thinks it will sell quickly in this market. After I pay off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, I'll have enough money to buy a small place outright somewhere I can afford to live comfortably on my retirement income. Mom, wait, Michael said, panic creeping into his voice. You don't have to do this. We can work something out. We can find a way to make everyone happy. Everyone happy? I asked, sitting back down to meet his eyes directly. When have you been concerned about my happiness? When have either of you asked what would make me happy? The question hung in the air, unanswerable because the answer was never. They'd been concerned about my compliance, my cooperation, my willingness to facilitate their happiness. But my own contentment had never been part of the equation. What would make you happy? Michael asked. And for a moment, I heard the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and declare them the most beautiful flowers in the world. Peace, I said simply. Respect. A home where I'm welcome rather than tolerated. A life where my opinions matter and my presence is valued rather than managed. You could have all that here, Linda said desperately, if we just communicated better, if we made different arrangements. No, I said with gentle finality. I couldn't, because you've both made it very clear that this isn't my home anymore. It's yours, and that's fine. But I won't pretend to be grateful for the privilege of being a stranger in my own life. 6 weeks later, I stood in the empty living room of what had been my home for 15 years, watching the moving truck pull away with the last of my carefully chosen belongings. The house felt enormous around me, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of family dinners and birthday celebrations and quiet Sunday mornings when Michael was small, and the future felt limitless with possibility. Michael and Linda had made themselves scarce during the moving process, supposedly giving me space to say goodbye, but more likely avoiding the uncomfortable reality of what their choices had made necessary. They'd tried, in the weeks following our kitchen conversation, to negotiate some different arrangement, some compromise that would allow them to keep the life they'd built while salving their consciences about my displacement. But I'd discovered something surprising about clarity. Once you have it, you can't unknow what you know. I couldn't unknow that my son had been willing to trade my comfort for his convenience. I couldn't unknow that my sister had taken my hospitality and transformed it into entitlement. I couldn't unknow that love without respect isn't love at all. It's just expectation dressed up in prettier clothes. The house sale had gone exactly as Patricia predicted, attracting multiple offers within days of listing. A young family with 2 small children had fallen in love with the big kitchen and the fenced backyard, seeing possibilities I'd forgotten were there. They'd offered full asking price and closed quickly, eager to begin the kind of family life I'd once thought would last forever. Michael had grown increasingly desperate as the reality of my departure became undeniable. He'd offered to buy the house himself, though his finances couldn't support such a purchase. He'd suggested rental arrangements, caretaking agreements, any formula that would allow him to keep what he'd taken while appearing generous toward the person he'd taken it from. "Mom, this is crazy," he'd said during one of our final conversations. "You're throwing away your whole life because we had a misunderstanding about household arrangements." Household arrangements. Even then, he couldn't name what had actually happened, couldn't acknowledge that he'd systematically erased my place in my own life and expected me to be grateful for whatever role remained. "I'm not throwing away my life," I'd replied. "I'm reclaiming it." Linda had tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and sisterly obligation. "Margaret, we're family," she'd said with tears that looked remarkably authentic. "Family doesn't abandon each other over hurt feelings. Hurt feelings. As if my objection to being made homeless in my own house was emotional sensitivity, rather than reasonable boundary setting. "You're right about family," I'd agreed. "Family doesn't abandon each other, but they also don't systematically displace each other and call it love." My new apartment was everything I'd hoped when I'd researched senior living communities online. A bright, modern space with large windows and minimal maintenance requirements, located in a town where the cost of living allowed me to breathe financially for the first time in decades. The building had a community garden where I could grow tomatoes and herbs, a library with comfortable reading chairs, and neighbors who were building new lives rather than clinging to old disappointments. Best of all, it was mine. Completely, unambiguously mine. No one could rearrange my furniture or pack away my photos or treat my preferences as suggestions to be considered and dismissed. No one could occupy my space while making me feel like a guest, or claim my resources while questioning my worthiness to control them. I'd kept only what brought me joy or served a practical purpose, donating decades of accumulated possessions to charities that could transform them into blessings for people who needed fresh starts. The process of choosing what to keep and what to release had been surprisingly liberating, like editing my life down to its essential elements. The photo albums came with me, along with my mother's china, and the few pieces of jewelry that held memories rather than monetary value. My books, carefully curated to include only favorites I'd actually reread. Kitchen equipment sized for one person who enjoyed cooking for herself, rather than performing domestic service for people who'd stopped appreciating the effort. 3 months into my new life, I received a phone call that didn't surprise me. Michael's voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd rehearsed what he was going to say, but wasn't sure how it would be received. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to let you know that Linda and I have decided to take a break." A break. The euphemism people use when they want to avoid admitting their relationship has collapsed under the weight of reality. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want Michael to suffer heartbreak, even if that heartbreak was the inevitable result of choices he'd made with his eyes wide open. "The thing is," he continued, his voice growing smaller, "I'm realizing that maybe I made some mistakes. About priorities. About what really matters. Some mistakes. About priorities." The careful language of someone trying to apologize without fully acknowledging what they were apologizing for. "Michael," I said gently, "what is it you're trying to tell me?" A long pause. The sound of someone gathering courage to say words that felt too big for his throat. "I miss you," he said finally. "I miss talking to you. I miss us, the way things used to be, the way things used to be. When he was the center of my universe, and I was the reliable foundation that allowed him to take risks and chase dreams because he always knew home would be waiting. I miss that too, I said honestly. But sweetheart, we can't go back to the way things used to be. We can only go forward to something different. I know, he said quickly. I know I hurt you. I know I took you for granted and made you feel like you didn't matter. I know I chose Linda over you, and that was wrong. The admission hung in the air between us. Years of pain finally acknowledged in words that felt too small for the damage they described. I'm glad you understand that now, I said. But understanding what went wrong isn't the same as knowing how to make it right. I want to try, he said with the earnestness of someone who'd finally grasped the magnitude of what he'd lost. I want to earn back your trust. I want to be the son you deserved instead of the son I became. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. We talked about respect and boundaries, about the difference between loving someone and possessing them, about how real relationships require ongoing choice rather than assumed obligation. We talked about Linda and what had made her attractive to him, and why that attraction had required my diminishment to flourish. Most importantly, we talked about forgiveness. Not the cheap kind that pretends hurt never happened, but the expensive kind that acknowledges damage while choosing to build something new from the ruins. I don't know if I can be the mother I used to be, I told him near the end of our conversation. She loved you so much that she forgot to love herself, but I think I might be able to be a different kind of mother, one who loves you from a position of strength rather than need. I think I'd like that, he said. I think I need that. 6 months later, Michael drove 3 hours to visit my new apartment. He brought flowers, daisies, not expensive roses, and he asked permission before rearranging anything, even something as simple as moving a chair so we could sit and talk more comfortably. He admired my garden, praised my decorating choices, and listened with genuine interest as I told him about my new neighbors and the book club I'd joined, and the part-time job I'd taken at the local library because I wanted purposeful activity, not because I needed the income. "You seem happy," he said over dinner I'd cooked in my small kitchen, a simple meal that tasted perfect because it was chosen and prepared according to my own preferences. "I am happy," I said, surprised by how completely true that statement felt. "I'm glad," he said. And then, with the vulnerability of someone who'd learned the cost of taking love for granted, "Do you think you might have room in this new life for a son who's still learning how to be worth your love?" I looked across my small dining table at this man I'd raised, seeing him clearly for the first time in years, not as an extension of myself or a reflection of my worth as a mother, but as a separate human being who was capable of growth and change and choosing love over convenience. "Yes," I said, "but not the old kind of room where I disappear to make space for you. A different kind of room where we both get to exist fully." "I'd like that," he said. "I think I'm finally ready for that. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. But sometimes, after the silence has done its work, there's space for new words, better words, words that honor both the love and the person doing the loving. We built something new from there, slowly and carefully, with respect as the foundation instead of need. It wasn't the same as what we'd had before, but it was infinitely better than what we'd lost. And for the first time in my life, I felt loved, not despite my boundaries, but because of them. I was finally completely enough.